everyone, Chris Patterson here, and hopefully you got a lot out of the last video that I posted about how to start structuring your story. Let me just recap what we talked about in the last video. Last video I talked about two things. Number one was write down and know how your story begins and how your story ends. And with that, you need to know where your protagonist is. Remember, your protagonist is the hero, the guy who or gal whose shoulder the camera's on, right? That is the person that we're primarily interested in within your story. Part of knowing the beginning and the ending is where is your protagonist, both physically, emotionally, mentally, and at the very beginning of the story, and where is your protagonist physically, mentally, and emotionally at the end of the story. The other thing that we talked about was knowing who your protagonist is and knowing who your antagonist is, and that is the person that is directly opposing your protagonist. And remember, again, it doesn't necessarily have to be a bad guy, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be a villain or someone who's evil. It's simply someone who opposes your protagonist. Okay, so today, let me talk a little bit about continuing this mapping out of your story. As you saw in my last video, most stories are structured with 3 acts. As you can see on the screen, this is kind of what all 3 acts look like. Act 1 is the beginning, Act 2 is the middle, Act 3 is the end. Oftentimes we refer to Act 1 as the setup. We'll refer to Act 2 as the action and the conflict, and we'll refer to Act 3 as the climax and the resolution, okay? So what needs to happen in each one of these acts? And so what I would encourage you to do as you look at this and as you plan out your story, again, let's take this step by step. That's why I'm doing shorter videos for these. You know, you can create a map that looks like what I have up on the screen. You can do this with some note paper. You can do it on a computer, create 3 columns. There's all different ways to do this, but I would really highly recommend that you map this out. This is something that I do in my own practice when I'm writing. So Act 1 is going to be roughly the first 25% of your book, okay? And really try to keep it to that first 25%. You know, if you go like 30%, that's cool. If it's only about 20%, that's cool. But if you're sitting around 10 or 15%, it's too short. You need, your audience, your readers need more setup, even if it's a character that they've read about before. And if it's like 50% long, it's too much. You're gonna lose reader interest. The first 25%, as you can see on your screen, this is the protagonist in the state that you determined from the last video. This is your protagonist in their original state of mind, in their original state physically, in their original state emotionally, okay? So your protagonist is who you present them at the beginning of your story. They have not changed yet, okay? Whether they're in a great place, a bad place, it doesn't matter. They are in whatever place you decide to start them in. Within your first act, towards the end, and in my next video, I'm gonna break this down even more for you, but towards the end of your Act 1, there needs to be an inciting event, right? There needs to be something that causes the protagonist to want to make a change. Again, it could be emotionally, physically, or mentally. And there needs to be a problem that needs to be solved, okay? Now, in the world of fantasy, which is what I write, a lot of times this is a grand adventure. The princess is kidnapped. We need to find the magic scroll. We need to, the monster needs to be killed. There's all kinds of different ways you can do this, but there's many, many different ways to create a problem that needs to be fixed, right? It can be something that's more emotional. It could be, you know, all of a sudden the star quarterback went down in your story and we got to find someone to replace that star quarterback, whatever it may be. And maybe your protagonist is all of a sudden realizing that he or she could be the star quarterback, okay? Act 2, this is the middle. This is going to be the vast majority of your book. So if you think about these 3 acts as 2 pieces of bread and then the sandwich in the middle, the sandwich is by far the bulk of, you know, the middle of the sandwich is by far the bulk of the sandwich, the meat, the cheese, all that stuff. The same with your book, okay? So 25 to 75% of your book is going to be Act 2. In Act 2, 2 things need to happen, okay? Or three things need to happen. Your protagonist needs to begin to change. Your reader needs to see the physical, emotional, and mental change that is happening within your protagonist. So if you find yourself writing and at the end of Act 2, you're about 75% of the way through your book, and your main character looks the same that they looked at the beginning of your book, you need to go back and you need to do some revision. Okay, we need to see an actual change in your main character as they move through Act 2. Okay, that 25 to 75%. Right around the middle of Act 2, so right around 50%. I shoot for 50%. This could certainly happen in different spots depending on the story. At 50%, there needs to be a point of no return, okay? So your main character, your protagonist, has embarked on a journey. Again, it can be a physical journey, a mental journey, an emotional journey, and there comes a point where they cannot turn around, right? They cannot go back, right? One of my favorites is The Hobbit. In The Hobbit, they reach the Misty Mountains, and that's pretty much it. That signifies, and that's about halfway through the book, and they cannot turn back from that point, okay? So there needs to be a point of no return. There needs to be a point where the main character recognizes that they can only continue to move forward, and because they can only continue to move forward, they must change. Right? This is a point where they realize they must make a change. They cannot go back to who they once were, again, physically, emotionally, mentally. And towards the end of Act 2, what you're going to find in most really successful books is there's going to be a potential disaster. Okay, there's going to be something that, and again, this needs to be believable, but where the reader recognizes that, oh no, this could all fall apart. Right? What the main character set out to do may not work. Okay, and so that's another really important component to that Act 2, that middle part of the book. Now, Act 3 is the climax and the resolution. Very early, so this is 75 to 100% of the book. This is the very last third of your book. In this portion of your book, obviously one of the things that's going to happen is your main character, your protagonist, is going to figure out this potential disaster. They're going to get themselves out of whatever sticky situation, whatever pickle they find themselves in, okay? And that is going to lead into the climax and the resolution. And oftentimes, what I find myself doing is, as the main character, as my protagonist overcomes this potential disaster, this major setback, what ends up happening is that then directly leads to the final, and again, in fantasy, it's oftentimes coupled with physical, right? But it can also be emotional and mental, but that final physical conflict, that final, arch enemy, that final villain, that final monster that the main character has to tackle. At this point, the character needs to be fully changed, right? They are now a new person. They are going to probably look a little bit like what they looked like at the beginning of the book, but they're going to be different, and people are going to recognize that difference. Now, I would caution you at this point to be very careful about making your main characters so different that they're unrecognizable. And that, of course, depends on the scope of your book. If it's something like Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett, that encompasses years and years and years, then the character at the very end of your book may not look like the main character at the very beginning of your book. My first book encompasses about, in total, about a 3 to 4 month period. So my main character, Eric, really does look like he resembles who he was at the beginning of the book. But there is some noticeable change. And then when you take a look at the whole trilogy, at the very end of the trilogy, again, there's more noticeable change, but he is still Eric, right? And it's because it's a much shorter scope of time. And then, of course, you have that full change culminates with a climax, right? That's when everything gets kind of put together, all of the problems get resolved, or depending on if you're writing a series or something like that, they potentially create a new problem that needs to be fixed. However, the old problem needs to be fixed. That's another thing that I learned in my writing. Even if you're writing a series, make sure that there is a problem that you can resolve within a book, right? Don't leave too many open-ended hangings. I kind of did that in my first trilogy, and I'm at a point where I'm not going to go back and change it, but I know that some of the criticism I received has to do with the fact that I do have some of these open-ended problems that were not fixed. And so you want to make sure that within each book, within each story, there is a problem that can get fixed, that can be resolved, okay? And then that resolution is either going to be the character, the main character, and the people around him or her realizing and understanding that full change, or it's going to be a realization of that full change that then transitions into another story. So this is your 3-act story structure. This is how I would suggest you set it up. I would definitely suggest that you create a template that kind of looks like this and fill in the blank for you and for your story. What's going to happen, right? What is the inciting event? What is the problem that needs to be solved? What is that point of no return? What is that potential danger? Give yourself maybe a paragraph, 4 or 5, 6 sentences to explain each one of those bullet points. And if you do that, I think you're really, really well on your way to really crafting a good outline that will eventually turn into a great story and a great book that people are going to enjoy, because there's a clear plan and there's a clear path. So this is Chris Patterson. Hopefully these writing tips are helping you out. Until next time, happy reading, happy writing. Make sure you like and subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you next time.